next topic we're going to look at, which is a local issue. It's relating to Paul Gadd, aka also known as Gary Glitter. And there have been reports in the national and the more local media in recent times, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, that he's going to be released, that he's going to go into an open prison, that he then is going to be relocated in 2023. Now that 2023 is effectively 8 years into a 16-year sentence. Now, I have massive issues with this whole idea of somebody who's, I'm not going to read through this, but somebody who's committed very, very, very serious crimes, that the speculation is that he will be allowed to go into an open prison 6 years into a 16-year sentence. I'm all for rehabilitation, Tom, but this guy is now 76. What chances has he got of rehabilitation, especially when he hasn't even, right throughout the whole process, he hasn't even admitted or accepted that he did anything wrong? And for the first time that we've heard that he might be conciliatory is from a far-right 1970s, early 1980s so-called comedian, Jim Davidson, who's come out and said, oh, he appreciates the error of his ways, he just wants to live out his life now back in society. And yet the evidence that's coming through from where he's been incarcerated, i.e. the Verne on Portland, and from other sources, suggests that he hasn't, or he isn't conciliatory. People who are on the same landing as him in terms of being officers, from what conversations I've had, there seems to be nothing there that suggests that he is ashamed. And I think also that the other problem is, Tom, is that the media are making things up. Firstly, I'll come back to the sentence in a moment. But firstly, there was reports in the papers some time ago that he was booed off the stage at a Christmas show. When you talk to, because he was singing apparently in a Christmas show, and he was booed off the stage by other inmates. Now you've got to remember that all the inmates in there are there for sex crimes of various reasons. Now when you look under the surface, like we were talking about in the previous topic, firstly, they haven't got a stage, and secondly, they never had a Christmas show. So somebody's making this up, and it's then being reported as fact in the newspapers, which then loads and loads of people are responding to. That's the type of society that we're now living in. It's not reality that we're responding to, it's make-believe. The same people that I've spoken to say that even when they have karaoke on the wing, Paul Gadd, aka Gary Glitter, refuses to take part. In fact, they argue that he's a miserable so-and-so. So there's all that garbage and all that rubbish that is being forced down people's throats. Now let's go back to the sentence. The idea that he will, in a few weeks, go to an open prison, be allowed to leave on a daily basis, and then he'll go back into society in 2023. Well, the information, again, I have from the Verne is that he'll almost certainly die in prison, that when he comes to be released, if he's managed to meet the requirements and tick the boxes of the board when it comes to being released halfway through a sentence, he'll be rearrested at the gate for other convictions that he hasn't yet been tried for, which means he'll end up back in court and, as I said, almost certainly be found guilty, and then see out the rest of his life probably back in the Verne. And he's aware of this. It's not like he isn't aware of it. He's aware this is going to happen. So whether he and Jim Davidson are conspiring to create this idea that he's a reformed character, I have absolutely no idea. But bearing in mind that he knows this, it's interesting that someone like Jim Davidson, who's renowned for racist, homophobic humour in the past, is now prepared to stand up and be an advocate for Gary Glitter at a time when we know that Paul Gadd knows himself that he's almost certainly going to die, if not in the Verne, then another institution for sex offenders. So and also, sorry, just one more point. Why are the national and why are the local, one local site called Dorset News argued that he was going to be repatriated. He wanted to be repatriated and he wanted to set up home in Dorchester. And it was poked on a Dorchester Facebook page. And obviously you had all these people underneath who read it, obviously, and they were responding to it, believing it to be true. And it's utterly made up. Or if it's not made up, it's coming from somewhere that's conning or fooling these people to write articles as if they were the reality.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary topic, really, and there's a number of issues there. One is, media lies and nonsense stories, which is obviously, I guess, that's all about clickbait. That's all about getting people to click on the articles, go to their site, which actually, which helps them get income in. The more people click and visit their site, the more traffic, the more that they can attract advertising revenue. So whether they're national newspapers or whether they're a local online site, they're obviously just making up stories, and this is exactly the sort of story that gets people to click. In their outrage, the notion that Gadd would be released early and settle in Dorchester, people are going to click to read it, and they're going to be horrified or outraged. So exactly the sort of thing that makes people click, and the more clicks they get, the more they're able to get advertising revenue in.
I understand.
Obviously a huge issue.
I understand that. I understand that, Tom. But my concern is that if you can't back it up with fact, I mean, what's to stop these sites, for example, in 3 months' time saying, "Oh, they're going to set up in Sherborne." He's going to set up in Sherborne, or then 3 months later, he's going to set up in Bridport, or he's going to set up in Lyme Regis, or he's going to set up in Poole. I'm sorry, I'm going on, but the point being is that unless they actually nail down reality and give that to the population, all the population are doing is responding to a prism of fake news.
Absolutely, Jace. I mean, that's pretty much where we're at, isn't it? We have been for some time, and most of that fake news is controlled by the billionaires, who set the news to suit their agenda, to get the Tories elected and re-elected again and again, and to allow them not to pay their tax, and to make vast amounts of money and profit from all sorts of things to do with the economy and workers' rights and so on and so forth. So the rich get richer, and the media is mostly owned by rich people who help that to happen.
But even for local news outlets, news outlets to be repeating this without doing any serious investigation or analysis first, going back to what you said about clickbait, it's almost entirely now that competitive dogma, if you like, that competitive paradigm that exists within the media, that nothing is more important than getting hits and competing with those others to get those hits, and screw the content.
Because media is almost entirely a business, or each media outlet is almost entirely a business. They don't care about the truth, they care about their bottom line, they care about their profits. Almost every media outlet is now run in that way, and journalists, if they're not already inclined to be like that, their owners and the editors certainly tell them that that's the kind of stuff they need to write. So we live in this awful post-truth world where the regulators are either unwilling or unable to control the content of our media. and and we're just fed a load of lies and things that benefit the rich. So, but going back to the issue, so there's a excuse me, there's a big issue obviously about truth telling here and clickbait and nonsense stories. But obviously there's also, you know, issues about the early release of people. I mean, it looks like it's unlikely to happen in this case. These stories are nonsense. It's unlikely to happen in this case. Whenever he does get released, he's likely to be rearrested and sent back to prison pretty sharpish. So, and I think I think more or less everyone in the country will be delighted to know that, because
can I just bring in,
deserves to be in prison.
Before you carry on, that sentence you just said there, Tom, I think everybody in the country would be delighted to know that. So it really does beg the question: why is somebody like Jim Davidson prepared? You know, as we know, with the history, for example, of the far right in relation to their so-called travails of going after sex offenders, especially obviously sex offenders who are non-white, but going after sex offenders, and then obviously it transpires that a lot of these white sex offenders exist within these far right groups like the EDL and have been prosecuted and sent to prison themselves. But what do you think someone like Jim Davidson stands to gain from this, knowing full well, as you just said, that, you know, almost the entire population, bar a small number, will find the idea of Gary Glitter or Paul Gadd being released as despicable?
It's bizarre. I mean, I have no idea. I didn't know anything about it, but I know that Jim Davidson recently does a regular show, a YouTube channel show. It's very, very right wing, with racist content and this sort of false nationalism, and so forth. And you know, I find him an incredibly unpleasant, racist, homophobic man. He's akin to Bernard Manning in terms of the nature of his so-called comedy. And so yes, I mean, it's bizarre that, as you say, the far right have always had this thing about paedophiles. You know, they rant on about paedophiles, particularly, as you say, paedophiles that are non-white. People like Stephen Lee, actually Lennon, obviously tries to expose paedophiles that are non-white, but never the white ones. And of course, so many far right leaders and activists have been done for paedophilia. So there's a suggestion that it's sort of you know, why man he doth protest too much, or whatever. That's not quite the right quote, but you know, the Shakespeare quote of he doth protest. Methinks he doth protest too much. Maybe it's a cover for their own actions, and so many of them have been arrested for either, you know, paedophilia and you know, having vast numbers of explicit child pornographic illegal photos on their computers and sharing them and so forth. So yeah, just bizarre that given that that's a far right trait, to be so vehemently anti-paedophile, it's really weird that Jim Davidson would be doing this. I can just imagine his supporters watching his channel, loving him for all his racist nonsense and nationalist nonsense that he comes out with, and then him sort of saying that he thinks Paul Gadd should be released early, and I can imagine them being very, very conflicted and not able to understand what's going on. What's going on? I don't understand. Yeah, I can just imagine it. It's yeah, weird. I mean, just going back to the point of early release before we finish on this, I think there is I would say a sort of national desire. You know, we shouldn't change the laws based on what's necessarily popular. I mean, if we did, we'd probably be bringing back capital punishment, which I wouldn't agree with, because I don't think anyone should have the right to kill, including the state or the judicial system. But there is something about, I think the majority of the population in this country disagree strongly with early release, like halfway through a sentence, eligibility for parole halfway through a sentence for people convicted of certain types of crime. violent and sexual crimes of a violent and sexual nature, you know, murder, rape, and paedophilia. I think those are things which should be far more exempt from early release. I understand that early release is an incentive for rehabilitation and good behaviour in prison. So it makes the life easier for prison officers if the prisoners have some kind of incentive to behave well and to become reformed characters, knowing that they could be released earlier. I understand that. And of course, we believe passionately in people's ability to rehabilitate. But crimes like those, like the ones I've mentioned, I think that there's a strong case for them to be completely exempt from any sort of early parole. And I think there'd be huge support for any Home Secretary that proposed such changes. I'd support them, obviously.
And exactly. And to finish off, I think the public should, the moral of the story is the public should wait for an official announcement from the Home Office before they respond and ignore everything else in the national or local press media that suggests anything without going back to what the authorities have determined. Because stories like this, they just lead to people wasting their time gossiping, talking, writing about it when it's based on, literally in some cases, no substance.